everyone. Welcome to VRIC Media, your most trusted voice in metals and mining. I'm your host, Darrell Thomas, and today we have the pleasure of interviewing Jonathan Newman of the Mises Institute. How you doing today, Jonathan?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on the show.
Yes, indeed. So, obviously love connecting with you all over at the Mises Institute and everything. And so let's just start kind of giving the audience just a brief introduction to who you are and what role you play at Mises.
Sure. Yeah. So my name is Dr. Jonathan Newman. I have a PhD in economics from Auburn University, which is just right across the street from us here at the Mises Institute. And my role here is as a research fellow. So I write papers for academic journals. I write for our website, and I speak at our conferences and events. We have student events like Mises University and Rothbard Graduate Seminar, in which I give some lectures. And so I'm here as one of the academics on the team here at the Mises Institute. The Mises Institute is an educational organization. So our mission is to teach and promote Austrian economics. That's what we want to see. We want people to read Murray Rothbard and Ludwig von Mises, Karl Menger. We want them to read these guys because we think that they're right about economics. We think that they're right about the way to view the world and the way the economy works. And so that's really our guiding mission, and everything that we do is centered on that.
Yeah, for sure. And this all comes back to sound money as well, sound money principles and things of that nature. And those of us that have been buying gold, buying silver for a long time, like we're buying it for a reason, right? And that reason is often, we know that money's being printed and they cannot print sound money. They cannot print real money. And so I'm glad to have you on the show, and I'm glad to hear that you all are continuing that good work and such. Let's just get a brief overview of how are you looking at things in the U.S. economy right now in regards to the Fed. Obviously the national debt just hit 39 trillion and such. Deficits are ballooning. We also have an increase in military spending, or a proposal to increase military spending. And so curious in your thoughts on all of that.
Yeah, so I think that the main problem is government spending. And as you said, that there's this proposal to increase government spending, defense spending up to $1.5 trillion, just this like outrageous numbers of like a 40% increase of what it is currently. And it's currently outrageous. And so that's the main problem. While we can look at debts and deficits, and of course, the debt number is huge. You said $39 trillion. The real problem is the level of government spending. And the reason why I think that is because it's the spending in excess of taxes that causes deficits, and accumulated deficits result in debt. So the reason why we would look at debt and say that this is bad, this is a huge number, it's unsustainable, is because it's a reflection of how much the government is spending. And the reason why we would say that government spending is a bad thing is because it's not subject to the profit and loss test of the market. So in the private market economy, a business lives and dies by the way that it treats consumers and serves consumers. So if a business takes some factors of production and purchases them at one price, and then they sell something to consumers at a price that consumers are willing to pay, and that price justifies its cost, then the business earns a profit. And we can say that those resources that were used in production were used beneficially. It's like that's the way consumers wanted those resources to be used. So the profits indicate that. But in the case of government spending, there's this disconnect. What the government collects, its revenues, is not associated with some voluntary payment for the services provided by government. So what the government collects is taxes, which they're taken coercively, which means. So I don't mean to use coercively in like a morally negative sense, although I do think that it is morally wrong to take things from people, like theft. But I just mean it in like a matter of fact, objective sort of way. Since there's no connection between what people are paying in taxes to the services that they're receiving from government, it means that government spending is destined to be a waste. It means that what government spends money on it's not going to be in line with what consumers want. That's the issue. And the problem is that there are these terrible incentives in which governments and their bureaucracies and the agencies enlarge. They get bigger and bigger. So no matter whether they fail their goals or if they succeed in achieving their whatever stated goals that they have, they just always get bigger and bigger. Now, one thing that allows government spending to get bigger and bigger and allows deficits to increase consistently and therefore debts to increase consistently is the fact that we have a money printer. So the Federal Reserve is there as a ready buyer of the U.S. government's debt, and it buys that debt with newly printed money. So what that means is the government is able to do all the spending without inflicting all of the pain in the form of regular taxes on the people. So they collect some in taxes, but then they finance the rest with this subtle form of taxation, i.e. monetary inflation. So they increase the money supply. And so we pay for this increased government spending in the form of, higher prices at the grocery store, higher prices at the gas pump, and so on. So you were asking about my view on, debts and deficits and spending. And that's how I think about those things.
Okay. So thanks for sharing that perspective. And I'm curious in your thoughts on, when this administration, first came in, there was talking about draining the swamp. What we've been finding is there's more swamp creatures added to the swamp. We've had, there was talk about, Doge cuts, cutting spending, but really that spending just got replaced with other spending. We've had, politicians like Kristi Noem and such said to have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars on ads and stuff, so there's corruption that's still taking place, and it's good that I guess folks that are being corrupt in that way are getting out of there. But I'm curious in your thoughts on when I listen to Ludwig von Mises, he talks about how these politicians are aiming to serve their constituents, and their constituents doesn't necessarily mean it's the average people, right? And so could you speak to how that plays into this? How these different parties come in and they want to serve their constituents, and their constituents may not necessarily, they may benefit from policies or such in one way, which is, which doesn't benefit, the people on the other side of it as well. And so just curious in your thoughts on that.
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Trump campaigned on draining the swamp. He campaigned on no new wars. He campaigned with Elon Musk promising, trillions of dollars of spending cuts with that new program. And it's, in my view, it's been a very big disappointment. Maybe a few wins here and there, but overall, just a huge disappointment. Especially in my view with the war in Iran, just a complete rejection of what he promised in his campaign, and it completely demolished the coalition that he built to get elected. That's my own 2 cents. That's not really Austrian economics. That's just my own way of thinking about it. But in terms of what you're talking about with the way politicians campaign and serving their constituents, you're bringing up some really important points that have been brought up in public choice theory, which is that politicians don't necessarily act in a way that reflects what the people who elected them want. And there's a few reasons for that. One reason is that voters are rationally ignorant. So this sort of seems like a contradiction in terms. What does it mean to be rationally ignorant? But the idea there is that voters realize that they don't really have that much of an impact on elections, which means if they don't have that much of an impact and it's somewhat costly to become informed and then vote on a particular policy or politician, then the costs outweigh the benefits in terms of becoming informed. And so people just don't learn about what policies will do, what politicians are promising to do, and what the effects of that will be. So voters are uninformed, and for a reason that's built into the system, and so that's a problem. But another issue is that we have special interests. So there are some small groups who can get some concentrated benefits when certain policies are enacted. Even though I can say this war in Iran is a disaster, there are certainly some groups who benefit as a result of that. So like there are certain people who are lobbying for that war, either for their own political interests or for like financial interests. Like you can think about defense contractors, they would benefit. So these are the people who will be the most vocal in advocating for certain policies and for certain politicians to be elected. And that explains why politicians sometimes they campaign one way so they can get the largest number of votes and swing that median voter their direction, but then they'll enact policies that are more in line with these special interest groups that represent a minority perspective, not necessarily the majority. So you're absolutely right, and you're getting into some well established concepts in public choice theory.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that I bring that up and like how it relates to even economics and such is. It's that, not everyone's invested in military contracts, right? Or defense spendings or defense stocks. And then we had the Dow touted at 50K. Americans' retirement portfolios are performing well and such. And then, and the market just starts to crater once we get into conflict with Iran. Gold and silver sold off and came under some pressure too. And then now we're at the, it's like we're at the mercy of whether DJT wants to enact a ceasefire or whether one moment he's feeling good about it and he wants to negotiate, or next moment he wants to take out a whole civilization, right? And this is impacting the portfolios of many people. And so some people are even like, finding their hedge and like, okay, we need to be liquid and such. And a lot of this has to do with, many of these lobbyist groups that are like, funding these politicians to advocate for these policies or advocate for this conflict because they benefit in some way, shape, or form. So they are a minority constituent that provides a huge amount of capital to some of these campaigns and such. And so, it's kind of like for me, I've been having a grim outlook. I've been trying to like, have a positive outlook, but man, it's hard to find it in this political realm and how it impacts the wealth and the finances of many people.
Yeah, I totally understand. Having this sort of grim outlook is something that we have to fight against every day. One thing that helps me, besides my faith, is I understand that the ideas that I believe in are true. It's not something that I believe in and promote simply because like it would, it provides me some sort of benefit, like in the same way that lobbying for some sort of policy would get the government to subsidize my industry or something like that. So the reason why I espouse Austrian economics and I talk about the effects of government spending, the effects of war, public choice issues, the problems with the Federal Reserve. The reason I espouse these ideas is because I think they're true. I think it's the truth. So that's a source of hope. Now, one thing that you mentioned is the issue with these special benefits for like small groups, like certain interests have these benefits that flow towards them, and this is something that Henry Hazlitt brought up in his book Economics in One Lesson. So he started off this book talking about how economics is plagued by more fallacies than any other field of study, and he was trying to understand or talk about why that is the case. So like if you open up, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, you'll see one economist saying one thing, you'll see another economist saying something else. You'll like the exact opposite sometimes. So there's a lot of debate and a lot of bickering among economists, right? So what explains that? Because you don't really see that in other fields, at least not as much. So it's not like there's, arguments over the fundamentals of physics, at least not to the extent that there is about the fundamentals of economics among economists. And so what Hazlitt pointed out is that, well, one issue with economics is that you can, if you argue in favor of some policy, that can provide benefits to one particular group. And he says that the art of economics is considering the effect of a policy not just in the short run, but also in the long run, and not just the effects on one particular group, but the effect of that policy or event on all groups, right? So that's what it takes to do good economics. That's what it takes to do economics in the right way, according to Hazlitt, is that you can't just consider the impact on one particular group. You have to consider the impact on everyone.
George and his team, a 16-year VRIC employee building some of the largest mining operations on the planet. We started a drill campaign. From the drill campaign, moving into a full engineering report and study. We came out with our pre-feasibility study in 2021, and it showed a really impressive economic case for advancing the project. We'll have final definitive feasibility out in December of this year. So in the space of 4 years, fully engineered, fully permitted. US Gold Corp is a near-term, low-cost gold producer in Wyoming. To learn more, go to usgoldcorp.com.
In your research, the Federal Reserve, so I think this upcoming month, Jerome Powell I think his term as president is up, or chair is up, or something like that. And then there was a lot of talk about Waller coming in and what kind of impacts is that going to have and such. And so just curious in what are you foreseeing with the Federal Reserve? They seem pretty quiet right now. I mean, obviously it seems like they're watching the war and whatnot, and what impacts that can happen from that, inflationary impacts, stagflationary impacts and such. And so just curious in your thoughts on the Fed.
Yeah, the Fed definitely wants to be quiet. They want to be in the background. They do not want all of the eyes focused on them. And the reason why is because they want to be boring. They don't want, a lot of people looking into what they're doing. They don't want a lot of people, making huge bets on some minor change in interest rates. The Fed wants to be in the background. And one thing that's been very fun to watch, very entertaining, like watching a movie almost, is watching all of this political theater between Trump and Powell, where Trump is threatening to fire Powell. Trump is saying there's also from his administration, there's lawsuits against Lisa Cook, who's a Fed official, and actually a criminal case against Jay Powell based on some statements that he made about the Fed building renovation project. And of course, a lot of this is couched in terms of a threat against the Fed's independence. And my view on that is that the Fed's independence is a complete myth. The Fed is not independent at all. It's totally dependent on what the government wants it to do. And the best evidence for this is just to watch what the Fed does whenever there's any sort of crisis, any sort of economic crisis, a war, any COVID crisis. The federal government, the presidential administration, wants to issue a bunch of stimulus checks or do a bunch of infrastructure spending or bail out banks. And so this requires a ton of new spending, which is not financed by taxes, which means that they have to borrow. And they know that they can't borrow that much without causing interest rates to skyrocket. And so they have to rely on the Fed as a money printer. Right. So the Fed is there as a money printer to back up whatever the government wants to do. So the idea that there's this wall of separation, there's this the government is doing one thing, and then there's this separate entity we call the Federal Reserve that's just unbiasedly pursuing its dual mandate is completely bogus. The Fed is there. The way that we should think about what the Fed is and what it does is it is a money printer for the federal government. That's how we should think about it, which means it's not independent at all. So the way that I see all of the drama between Trump and Powell is in that light. It's like they're pretending like there's some sort of sacred independence that needs to be maintained, but it's a complete myth. And so it's just sort of fun to watch. Once you really understand what the Fed is, it's fun to watch all of the political theater that goes along with it. But in terms of the future, so you're talking about a new Fed chair coming in. I don't really know what to expect. I mean, since Trump appointed him, I expect that he'll probably be more expansionary than Powell would otherwise be. So Trump wants to boost the numbers, get GDP to go up, get spending to increase, get employment to increase, maybe counteract some of the effects of the tariffs and the war in Iran. So we could probably expect that sort of thing, but who knows? It just sort of depends. That's one of those things that's impossible to predict.
I think I said Waller earlier. I think it's Warsh. Worse, something like that. Yeah, Kevin Worse or something. So I'm curious of your thoughts on like, okay, so there's this illusion of independence, and I know that, there's also like you have these, liberals or conservatives, and you may have a Fed governor who's on the more liberal side of things, or someone who's on the more conservative side and such, and then you have these kind of toxic in civil kind of back and forths with the, on this political spectrum. And I'm kind of wondering, like, how does that play into this? I mean, because ultimately, like, when there's a crisis, you do see that the Fed will come to the Powell was under Trump's first administration when COVID hit. The Fed came to bail out the markets. They printed trillions, and Trump signed his names on the checks. All right, same thing. Biden came in. The Fed was still printing before they started hiking rates and such. And so they supported both parties and whatnot. But sometimes there seems like there's just kind of like toxic conflict when it comes to being either diplomatic or civil and in politics and such. And it seems like that's been driving some weird conflict on the main stage.
Yeah, the way I view that is it's just a superficial drama. And like you said, it's like, just look at what the Fed does whenever there's a crisis. So what the Fed does is it's there to finance the government's deficits, and it will always do that. So the way that I think about the personal conflict between like Trump and Powell, for example, is that Trump is using this as a political tool or political strategy, so that when there is some sort of crisis, some sort of economic crisis like a recession or stock market crash, something like that, then Trump will be able to point at Powell and blame him for those problems, as opposed to accepting the blame himself. Now, I don't really think, what's really interesting is that whenever the economy is doing great, the Fed and the president will take all of the credit for that, even though they have nothing to do with it except for just like getting out of the way. That the way that you get economic growth is by letting entrepreneurs do what they do best, which is guessing consumer demands and arranging factors of production, innovating, making new things that consumers want. That's how we get economic growth. Notice that in that description, the president and the Fed chair don't appear at all. So the only thing that they can do to promote economic growth is just to get out of the way. But of course, when we have economic growth or a period of no huge business cycles or financial crises, then they'll take all the credit. But then once things go bad, once you have a financial crisis or a recession, then there's a bunch of finger pointing. It's like, oh, it's the Fed's fault. Oh, it's the president's fault. Or, of course, the Fed chair would never say it's the president's fault. He would never say it in those terms, but he'll say things like the debt is on an unsustainable path, or these forces combine to create this situation. I think I'm paraphrasing Milton Friedman at this point. These forces combine to make this terrible situation, and we're doing the best we can to respond to it. But notice that there's no acceptance of blame when that sort of thing happens. Mm-hmm. So to get back to your question, that's how I view these sorts of conflicts. It's like a preparation. It's like setting down a roadmap for later on when there is a crisis, when there is a recession. Trump can say, I told you guys Powell is terrible, or it's all the Fed's fault, that sort of thing.
Yeah. I could definitely see that happening. So in one of your recent speeches, you talked about how to like end the Fed. Mm-hmm. And there was a lot of, so when these criminal charges came out against Jerome Powell, there were some folks that were coming out saying, end the Fed. As in like they were in support of the weaponization of the DOJ against the Federal Reserve and such. And so, what kind of impacts could that have on like what are the pros and cons of that? I imagine like there's some pros for the long term, especially when we're talking about bailing out banks and things of that nature, right? Where these big institutions get huge bailouts and the average citizen doesn't get anything, right? I imagine that, that's a huge plus, but, I also think that, there may be some carnage in the process of that as well. And so just curious in your thoughts on like, When folks say end the Fed, what does that look like?
Yeah, there definitely would be some short-term carnage, but it's carnage that we should be delighted to see. And the reason why we should want to see that sort of short-term carnage is because it's based on an unwinding of artificial stimulus from the Fed's existence. So when you have a money printer, there's going to be localized benefits to the sectors that are closest to the money spigot. So this is something that an economist by the name of Richard Cantillon talked about way back in the 1700s. So whenever there's an increase in the money supply, that increase in the money supply does not come into the economy evenly. It doesn't go into everybody's pocketbooks at the same time, right? So there's not some sort of like proportional increase in everybody's money when there's an increase in the money supply. No, what happens is that it comes into the economy at a particular point. So in the case of the Federal Reserve, when they print money and they purchase securities from big financial institutions, that new money enters the economy through these big financial institutions, and so they are the first ones to benefit. They have higher income than they otherwise would have. They can pay higher prices than they otherwise would be able to, and so they can acquire real assets, future goods, cash flows that come to them into the future. They can do that before prices increase generally. So when they spend the money, so they bid up the prices of the things that they purchase, then the people who receive that money by selling to those big financial institutions, so that could be borrowers, because a lot of these big financial institutions are heavily involved in credit markets. So then borrowers are able to get the money, and so they can use it to bid up things like houses, bid up prices of commercial real estate, bid up prices of the various things that. Same thing would apply to like consumer loans. People can bid up the prices of consumer goods. And so the idea that I'm trying to convey here is that there's like a rippling out effect. The money comes into the economy through a particular point, and then there's localized benefits. The closer you are to the money spigot, the closer you are to where that new money is coming in, the better off you are, the more benefits you receive. And there's people on the outskirts who are on fixed incomes, or they're like the last ones to receive the new money. And so they have to start paying all these higher prices that have been bid up by others in the chain, earlier in the chain. And so they're worse off as a result. So they actually see real resources flow away from them and towards the center where the money is coming in. Okay, so to bring this back to what we were talking about, what does that mean? It means that the sectors that are closest to the Fed, closest to the money spigot, they're artificially big. So that's going to be like finance, insurance, real estate. A lot of people over the past few decades have talked about financialization, and I view that as a 100% a consequence of money printing. But people also talk about income and wealth inequality, and well, I think that like any healthy economy is going to have some level of income inequality that can certainly be exacerbated by money printing. And so if you've got tons and tons of money printing, it means that these sectors and all this income inequality that's exacerbated by money printing is it's put on steroids. It's huge. And so what does that mean? So if you end the Fed, then you're going to cause a lot of damage to those sectors and businesses that have become dependent on money printing to survive. So those big financial institutions, they only survive at the size that they are because they just get this steady flow of new money being pumped into the economy. And so, yes, there would be some short-term carnage, but that carnage is something that we desperately need. If we want to economize resources, if we want like a healthy sized financial sector, if we want a healthy, sustainable real estate sector where we don't see housing prices doing ups and downs all the time, then we should want those sorts of things to be subject to an unhampered market economy that's not being inflicted upon by money printing. Okay, so there's the short-term carnage. The long-term gain is huge, totally worth it. The long-term gain is sustainable economic growth. So we wouldn't have business cycles all the time. We wouldn't have this recurring theme of financial crises. We would have sustainable, smooth economic growth. There would be an incentive to save. Right. So when you're in an environment with consistent price inflation, like the Fed actually targets 2% price inflation, when you're in that sort of environment, there's not as much of an incentive to save. Your incentive is to invest. Your incentive is to play the stock market casino game, right? As opposed to setting aside money for retirement. But if there was more stability in prices, or even, God forbid, some price deflation where things are getting cheaper over time, then there's much more of an incentive to save, which means we get more capital accumulation, we get healthier, stronger economic growth, people are better off. There's all sorts of wonderful benefits when people live in that sort of environment, as opposed to one where we have consistent money printing and price inflation. So in my view, we should definitely end the Fed. There would be some short-term carnage, but it's carnage that we should relish. It's carnage that we should hope for. And the long-term gains are absolutely worth it.
Yeah. I mean, with your background, I think it'll be good to ask you this question. So I'm recently reading I'm currently almost done reading the book 1929 by Andrew Ross Sorkin. And he talks about, because I wanted to understand, what actually happened in 1929. So obviously we had Calvin Coolidge who was, I like Calvin Coolidge. It seemed like he was just hands off, hey, government, hands off, right? We had a boom during that time, and then Herbert Hoover came in and such, and there was this big battle between the markets and the Fed. And the Fed was looking to raise interest rates to prevent speculation and such. And then the markets were like, no, if you do that, you're going to cause a crisis and such. And you had all these speculators in the market. And so when we look at those types of, obviously that was a huge event, right? And you had a lot of people borrowing on margin, and average people margin borrowing to invest and speculate and such. And so it was massive, right? But just thinking about that as because you do have these, capital cycles, you do have these times where you have these booms and busts, and arguably these are healthy, right? Where you get more speculation and you have to wash it out and kind of reset. So I'm curious in your thoughts on that time period, when you had the Federal Reserve who were okay, we need to prevent speculation so that we don't have this crisis. And then you had the markets who were no, it's the Fed. If the Fed intervenes, we're gonna have a crisis. And so I'm just curious in your thoughts on those.
So the way Austrians think about business cycles is through this lens. So you're right, there is a healthy aspect of the business cycle, but the healthy component, the healthy part of the business cycle is the correction phase, as you mentioned. So during a boom phase of the business cycle, which is triggered by artificially low interest rates. So when the Fed or when fractional reserve banks are increasing the supply of credit, and that credit is extended beyond the supply of real savings. So you have people set aside money, they're willing to lend a certain amount. So that's a healthy supply of savings that businesses can then use to expand, buy new factors of production, produce things that consumers want. But when you increase the supply of credit beyond what people have really set aside, then you cause businesses to start all of these projects that are not backed by real savings. So you get entrepreneurs starting projects that are longer term, they're riskier, requires more capital investment, more R&D. So these longer production projects that were only started because interest rates were artificially low. They were not started because there was an actual supply of real savings there. So that's, in the Austrian view, that's what starts the business cycle. And so what do we get? We get a boom. We get an increase in employment. We get an increase in consumption spending, increase in investment spending. Everything looks great. GDP goes up. Unemployment rate goes down. Stock market is reaching new highs. It looks like everything is wonderful. New businesses are being started. But then what happens is there's a reckoning. And that reckoning is something that's built into the process itself. There's not enough real capital available, or real labor. There's not enough, resources to actually complete those projects. So since the projects were started not based on a real setting aside of resources, if it was based on artificial credit, it means that they can't be completed. So we actually run into a scarcity problem. There's just not enough resources to complete all those projects. So you see the cost of production go up, You see the demand isn't really there. People actually didn't set aside the money to demand the things that would eventually be produced. And so all those projects had to be abandoned. So entrepreneurs liquidate their projects, they lay off workers, sell their land, sell their factory, or they just, sit with not being used until they can hopefully find somebody who's willing to purchase it. And so you get a big decline in production, you get a big spike in the unemployment rate, stock market declines, crashes, banks fail if they were the ones that overextended the credit to begin with. So that's how Austrians view the business cycle. And Murray Rothbard, so after you finish reading Sorkin's 1929, I recommend you read America's Great Depression by Murray Rothbard. What he does is he presents this theory in chapter 1, but then he applies it to the Great Depression, and he shows that there was this expansion of credit during the 1920s. And so we got a crash in 29, and then Hoover, and then after Hoover, we had FDR. They employed all of the wrong sorts of policies that resulted in this recession turning into the Great Depression. So what they did in particular was they instituted these huge new government agencies that were controlling wages and controlling prices. They were encouraging farmers to destroy their crops and destroy their livestock, because they were trying to influence prices in a certain way. And so they were doing all these terrible policies that were preventing the real correction from happening. They're preventing the market from actually wiping out, liquidating the malinvested resources, and then allowing entrepreneurs to find new, productive, and profitable ways to use those resources. So I highly recommend that book. But that's how Austrians look at 1929 and the Great Depression.
Yeah. I got that book on my audio book list. I think it's like 20 hours or something, 25 hours. So I gotta put my maybe put it on at the gym or something, and just dissect it 1 hour at a time.
Well, one recommendation I have, because that's a big commitment. But one recommendation is you can look at lectures from Mises University. So I know people like Roger Garrison and Robert P. Murphy have given lectures on the Austrian view of the Great Depression. So you might check there. And those are that's like a 45 or 50 minute chunk as opposed to 20 hours.
Yeah, for sure. That makes a lot of sense, because now when we look at since 2008, right? The Fed came in, money printers galore, and we started QE, quantitative easing, to prevent the market from collapsing. So it was more like government intervention. And then now we have this kind of where it seems like we're in this weird dynamic where if the markets go down a certain amount or a certain percentage, that the Fed has to come in and rescue the markets. You got so much leverage built up in the system. You have so much people's retirement portfolios are on the line and such. And so there's many people that I follow in the space that talk about, the big print, or anytime something that some crisis happens, the Fed's going to come to the rescue. And so it seems like we're kind of in this same dynamic as back in 1929, where the government came in and implemented these policies to try to keep the market from flushing out.
Yeah, you're right. There's a reason why Austrians call it the business cycle as opposed to the boom bust event that happened one time. And the reason why is because what happens the way governments respond during the bust, when we should allow this liquidation correction phase to complete, the way government responds is with additional government spending, a lot of it deficit financed, which means the Fed is going to rev up the money printer. But as you said, we get things like quantitative easing, we get bank bailouts, and so that introduces a bunch of moral hazard into the banking system, and also we get huge increases in the supply of credit backed by new money printing, which causes the problem that caused the problem in the first place, right? So the reason we call it a business cycle as opposed to like a one-time thing that occurs is because the way the government responds to a recession actually sets the stage for another crisis and another business cycle on down the road. And it's a terrible downward spiral to be in.
Yeah. That's very enlightening, and appreciate you joining me for having that conversation. And such. So, Dr. Newman, where can folks connect with some of the content you all are putting out? You all are doing a lot of work at Mises, and want to make sure we highlight that.
Yeah, so I recommend that your viewers check out our website at mises.org, mises.org. We have events around the country, so you can go to our events page to see what we've got coming up. We've got events in California, Oklahoma, North Carolina coming up this year. But we also, if you're a student, if you're an undergraduate student, I highly recommend you check out Mises University. For graduate students, we have Rothbard Graduate Seminar. But suppose you're not a student or you can't come to one of our events, our website has a huge amount of resources. So we have all books written by Rothbard and Mises, all these great authors in the Austrian tradition. But also we have commentary on current events. So we've got people like Connor O'Keefe, he writes an article every week about the big thing that's happening in the world or in the U.S. And so it's a great resource for people to check out. And you can check out my articles there as well. So thank you so much for having me.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, definitely got to have you back sometime and everything. You all be sure to hit the subscribe button. Let it how you support. Let it have these conversations just to see how and understand, see and learn and understand how how does all of these markets and such come together, and what's the glue that holds it together and such, and what are the underlying problems. And so I'm glad to discuss that today, with the Federal Reserve and these politicians being the problem to a lot of the things that we're seeing today. And so I appreciate you, Dr. Newman, and you all be sure to hit the subscribe button if you haven't yet. Thank you all for watching.